Let's talk about The Devil Wears Prada 2. There are certain movies that have become permanent fixtures in pop culture, and between its eclectic fashion choices and zingy one-liners, 2006's The Devil Wears Prada was fated to become one of them. And for the last 2 decades, it's had a firm grip on fashion lovers and chick flick devotees alike. Because of that popularity, there was a lot of interest when a sequel was announced. And after making nearly $500 million at the box office, safe to say it was a success. But does that mean it was good? Today I'll be talking about what I did and didn't like about The Devil Wears Prada 2, including the characters and the clothing. Obviously, there will be spoilers for both movies. Don't say that I didn't warn you. Also, my last 2 movie-related videos got hit with copyright claims, and I'm not trying to go a 3rd week without getting paid, so I'll be using a minimal amount of clips. Don't blame me, blame the studios who don't respect fair use. Now let's get into it. The movie picks up 20 years after the first, with Andy Sachs now working as a serious journalist, until out of the blue, she and the rest of her team get laid off. At the same time, Miranda Priestly comes under fire after Runway accidentally publishes a glowing piece about a sweatshop brand. In order to save face, the owner of aalyiah Clark brings in Andy to overhaul the magazine's editorial department and win back the public's trust. While there, she reunites with some familiar faces, but continues butting heads with Miranda, who's unimpressed with her attempts to bring real news to Runway. Things pick up when Andy lands a rare interview with Sasha Barnes, the newly divorced wife of Benji Barnes, a flashy tech billionaire. This puts her in Miranda's good graces. That is, until the owner of aalyiah Clark suddenly dies. His son takes his place, and he immediately announces plans to gut the magazine's already dwindling budget. To save Runway and all of their jobs, Andy hatches a plan to get Benji to buy the magazine, all with a little help from his new girlfriend, Emily. Everything seems to be going according to plan until it's revealed that Emily intends to take over the magazine and fire Miranda as revenge for mistreating her all of those years ago. Andy and Miranda set aside their differences and go to Sasha, who agrees to buy the magazine herself. The movie ends with everyone at Runway keeping their jobs and Emily and Andy agreeing to be friends. The sequel is acutely aware of its fandom, so it can't help but be a bit referential. Thankfully, it gets the callbacks out of the way pretty quickly, with brief glimpses of cerulean belts and Andy eating a bagel. Where the first film was a commentary on the fashion industry, the sequel shifts its focus to the state of journalism, and I personally think it's a pretty accurate representation. They poke fun at how advertisers and social media virality have now taken precedence over anything else, not to mention the looming threat of unemployment. Unfortunately, it still feels like a pretty shallow take on the subject, really only highlighting the negative aspects of the job without any of the positives. Part of the problem is that Andy never actually feels like a real editor. She's constantly writing, but it's always by herself in her tiny office. We never see her leading a meeting of scrappy young writers, none of her articles make an impact on the general public, and she never gains the professional respect of her colleagues. In the first movie, Andy was a stand-in for the audience, developing a new appreciation for the fashion industry, warts and all. But in the sequel, everyone acts like being a journalist is a stupid career path, and that never really changes. So by the end of the movie, you're left wondering why any of these characters would stay in such a thankless industry. The sweatshop story that sets the events of the film in motion are a not-so-subtle nod to Shein. The scandal is supposed to make Miranda public enemy number 1, but honestly, I don't think it would cause nearly as much backlash as the film suggests. The vast majority of Americans already act like they're entitled to every new microtrend at a minuscule cost, fully aware of and completely unbothered by the people in the global south making said clothing. Sure, there might be some talk about the story, but it certainly wouldn't impact the company's bottom line enough that they'd send in reinforcements. I think a more effective scandal might have been something closer to the Bon Appetit test kitchen controversy. For those who don't remember, for a brief period, Bon Appetit's video personalities were the darlings of the internet, until it came out that the company had been underpaying and sidelining its non-white staff for years. Apologies were written, people were fired, but the format never really bounced back. We already saw in the first movie how vicious and cruel Miranda could be. It'd only be a matter of time before someone put everything she said into a Twitter thread, so why not lean into that? Considering Jeff Bezos' very public relationship with Anna Wintour, funding the Met Gala, and allegedly being in talks to buy Condé Nast, I was genuinely surprised that the film had the nerve to poke fun at an out-of-touch billionaire, especially one so clearly inspired by Bezos, down to the unnerving plastic surgery and tacky girlfriend. One of my biggest issues with the sequel is the sheer size of the cast. They brought back every main character from Runway, and then added a whole new roster on top of that. There's Irv's son, the Barneses, Andy's boyfriend, Miranda's husband, not to mention multiple assistants. It just feels overcrowded, and honestly, very few of the new additions bring anything meaningful to the story. Andy's love interest is probably the weakest of the bunch, although that might just be because I personally found him annoying. His endless patience and willingness to bend over backwards to accommodate Andy is nice on paper, but it was so unrealistic that I was half expecting him to reveal himself as the real villain a la Hans in Frozen. He was just a rom-com Gary Sue, so bland and boring that it was kind of pathetic. To make matters worse, Patrick Brammall and Anne Hathaway have absolutely zero chemistry, making every scene that they share feel like pulling teeth. Now, I won't say that he had no impact, because if you removed all of his scenes, I actually think the movie would be better. Harsh, but true. All of that time on that romantic subplot would have been better spent on the characters who did have potential, like Amari, who was totally wasted. Her character is pretty similar to Emily in the first film, but we don't get any insight into her inner workings, so she's just a run-of-the-mill mean girl. There are so many new assistants that I personally think they could have cut it down to just her, which would have furthered the point that Runway/magazines in general don't have the same budgets they used to. Irv could have given Amari to Andy when she got to Runway, and having to share an assistant could have caused further tension between the two older women. This would allow Amari to be more involved with the story, while adding an interesting subplot where she's torn between Miranda and Andy. Simone Ashley looked absolutely amazing in every scene, to the point that I actually wonder if they had to cut down her role to not pull focus from the lead actors. The poor girl just has really bad luck when it comes to that sort of thing, having also been cut from F1. The first film didn't have that many industry cameos, only from the likes of Gisele Bündchen, Heidi Klum, and Valentino, who were big enough names that they could stand up to Anna Wintour. The sequel included a lot more people from various industries, including Donatella Versace, Ashley Graham, Amelia de Moldenberg, and Karl Anthony Towns. Lady Gaga was probably the most notable celebrity cameo, with her character having a fictitious feud with Miranda. I thought that her initial introduction was funny, but I wasn't a fan of her performance number. It felt like a cheap way to pad the runtime and created a really weird tonal shift, although I did enjoy the song. The Devil Wears Prada 2 marks Meryl Streep's first official sequel, and without question, she's the best thing the movie has to offer. She slips back into Miranda Priestley like she never left, although I'll admit that the character's edges have been softened. Some people complained about it, but I thought it made sense. She's older, she has a decent support system, not to mention a soft spot for Andy. But with that said, I can agree that I wanted to see more cutthroat moments from her, instead of mumbling about political correctness and struggling with her coat. In the years since the first film's release, the perception of Miranda's character has evolved from an evil dragon lady to more of a girl boss, and the double standard of how she would be perceived if she were a man is admittedly something that they address. But it does feel like they were too afraid of making her unlikable this time around. What happened to the Miranda who would throw everyone under the bus to save herself? Also, as funny as the moment is, Miranda would never fly coach. Anne Hathaway, on the other hand, is the film's weak link. I can't tell if she just couldn't find the character or if the writing let her down, but Andy's entire arc just feels like a lazy rehash of the first film. It's supposed to be 20 years later, but she's the same exact person, if not more socially awkward. She's so all over the place and constantly stumbling over her words that you question if she can even do the job she's been hired to do. And it starts to feel like her success comes from being in the right place at the right time. She has no sense of authority, and ironically, she just winds up slipping right back into the assistant role, spending half her time calling random people to help Miranda. Instead of giving her no family, no job, and a crappy apartment, it could have been interesting if Andy actually had a pretty good life that showed you didn't have to sacrifice everything to be a successful woman. They kind of hinted at that sort of thing with her friendship with Lily, which I loved. I I knew the character would be returning, but I expected it to be a quick cameo and that'd be it. So it was great to see the two of them hanging out and supporting each other repeatedly over the course of the film. I would have loved to see Andy choose to help Runway not out of desperation, but out of gratitude, and then make a point of trying to run the office in a totally different way than Miranda did, only for it to blow up in her face. Like, imagine on the way to Milan, they let all of the bosses fly business class, but because Andy wants to be one of the people, she gives up her seat for someone else, just to get sick in economy and throw up all over an advertiser. Sadly, Nigel is right where we left him, and although he's finally rewarded for his loyalty to Miranda, I feel like the film glosses over it. We don't even get to see him make his big speech, and he worked so hard on it. It is nice that he's the one who laid the foundation for Andy to make her return, but otherwise, his character doesn't do much. And I wish they'd explored some of the tension that might have built between him and Miranda, especially since the inspiration for the character, Andre Leon Talley, had a public falling out with his editor-in-chief. There's also all this talk from Nigel about Andy needing to keep all the clothing she borrows in pristine condition, so you're expecting all that to lead somewhere, but it doesn't. She spills something on a dress, and it just becomes an excuse for her to be in the kitchen at the same time as Miranda. Why not have Nigel actually get mad at her for once, and lecture her about expecting all of these things to be handed to her just because she wants it? Then there's Emily, who has been forced out of Runway and is now a senior executive at Dior. I don't mind her being the twist villain, but it just doesn't feel earned, mainly because she and Miranda don't interact enough for us to get an idea of Emily's resentment. Personally, I don't think this level of ambition lined up with her character. She was obsessed with clothes and having access to power, but not professional success in a corporate sense. I truly think she would have been perfectly happy just having Benji buy her things instead of trying to run Runway. But with that said, her reconciliation with Andy is one of the most satisfying moments in the entire film, since it offers us a rare moment of vulnerability from the character. Now, like a lot of people, I was most excited to see the clothing in the sequel, as the fashion in the first film was one of the things that made it so memorable. Costume designer Patricia Field, who was even nominated for an Oscar for her work, had to call in a lot of favors in order to get her hands on the luxury pieces used in the first movie. This was because a lot of designers were wary of the project out of fear of upsetting Anna Wintour. And because of that, Field had to get creative, mixing brands and pulling pieces that weren't super mainstream. This led to a more curated look for each character that was not only distinct, but innovative. The sequel's costumes were handled by Molly Rogers, who also took over for Field on the Sex and the City sequel series, and Just Like That. This time around, brands were fighting to be included, and honestly, you can tell, with the clothing looking like it was chosen to keep sponsors happy instead of serving the characters. Take for instance the dress Andy wears to the Hamptons party. The way everyone goes on about it, you expect it to be fit for a queen, but instead, it's this. Look, it works perfectly well for an outdoor barbecue, but I don't buy that 3 separate people would comment on how pretty it is. It just felt forced. Now, I'm not saying that all of Andy's outfits were terrible. In fact, I quite liked her workwear, but a lot of them just didn't make sense. Take, for example, the moment when Andy runs off to talk to Benji. Why on earth would she be wearing a sequin jumpsuit when she's trying to be inconspicuous? She isn't an idiot. Miranda's wardrobe has received a slight update from 2006, but overall, they still feel like pieces she would actually wear. Well, most of them at least. And Meryl does a great job of pulling off the more outlandish looks. Emily's outfits are the worst offenders by far. The intent is to signal her nouveau riche reinvention, which is accurate, but it feels totally out of character. The old Emily wore Vivienne Westwood and had a cool, slightly punk edge. This new Emily plasters herself with Dior logos and wears shiny latex. And don't even get me started on her horrible blonde wig at the end. Wouldn't it have made more sense for her to be blonde while wooing Benji and doing a job she hates, before switching back to her signature red at the end when she's being her true self? That just feels like storytelling 101. Over the years, I've covered a lot of these belated sequels. Hocus Pocus 2, Freakier Friday, Disenchanted, The Craft Legacy, Beetlejuice. But out of the bunch, The Devil Wears Prada 2 is probably the most enjoyable. I know it doesn't sound like it based on what I've said so far, but I laughed out loud multiple times and really enjoyed the spectacle of it all. I wouldn't exactly say that it stands on its own. You kind of need to be a fan of the original for it to work, but it has a certain charm to it that many of the others are missing. And while the movie is far from perfect, it has its moments. I really liked that it wasn't trying to cater to the next generation like so many of these belated sequels. The focus isn't on a new batch of teenage characters loosely linked to the original cast in order to give the franchise a youthful twist. Instead, they've allowed the characters to grow up alongside the people who went and watched it in theaters the first time. Don't get me wrong, it's still a cash grab, but at least it isn't making a total mockery of the original. Obviously, there's an audience for these sorts of movies, but I really hope that the lesson Hollywood takes away from The Devil Wears Prada's success isn't let's keep making sequels, and instead, let's make movies with characters and storylines people will still be invested in 20 years later. What did you think of The Devil Wears Prada 2? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!